The gravitational well of the Cresvihal system did not offer a welcome so much as a demand for total submission. It was a suffocating expanse of dark matter pockets and screaming pulsars that had claimed more vessels than the local sector's history books cared to record. Within this oppressive void sat the Vanguard of Indifference, a ship that lived up to its name not through a lack of capability, but through a weary, generational exhaustion. Its hull was a patchwork of lead-lined alloys and reinforced ceramics, scarred by cosmic radiation and the kinetic signatures of a dozen forgotten skirmishes. Inside, the atmosphere was thick with the scent of recycled oxygen and the sharp, metallic tang of ozone. Theron sat at the primary navigation console, his fingers hovering over a tactile interface that predated the shift to neural linking by nearly a century. He preferred it that way. Physical switches didn't suffer from the synaptic lag of a tired mind. His gaze was fixed on the long-range sensor sweep, watching the rhythmic pulse of a distant star as it struggled against the encroaching shadow of a wandering black hole. The humans on this ship were not heroes of some grand galactic crusade. They were the scavengers of the debris left behind by empires that had thought themselves eternal. To the rest of the galaxy, humanity was an anomaly of persistence, a species that flourished in the cracks of reality where more sophisticated races found the conditions untenable. The Cresvihal system was one such crack, a graveyard of ambition where the laws of physics seemed to bend under the weight of sheer atmospheric pressure. Theron adjusted the dampeners, feeling the ship groan in protest as it dipped into the outer edges of a gas giant's magnetosphere. The ship's internal comms crackled with the dry, rasping voice of Vaxon, the chief engineer who had spent so much time in the bowels of the engine room that his skin had taken on the grayish hue of the coolant pipes. Vaxon didn't believe in formal reports or the structured hierarchy that the newer colonies tried to enforce. He believed in the machine, and the machine was currently screaming. He informed Theron that the starboard thruster assembly was vibrating at a frequency that suggested imminent structural failure, or at the very least, a very loud explosion that would leave them spinning into the dark. Theron didn't panic. Panic was a luxury for those who hadn't seen the heat death of a subsector firsthand. He simply rerouted the power flow through the auxiliary conduits, bypassing the stressed segments and ignoring the warning lights that flared crimson across his dashboard. It was a temporary fix, a mechanical lie told to the ship to keep it moving for another few light years. The humans had mastered the art of the temporary fix, while the sophisticated Ethelgard or the rigid orthodoxy would have abandoned a vessel the moment its primary core showed a 3% variance in output. Humans would keep it running with wire, spit, and a stubborn refusal to die. It was this trait that made them both respected and reviled in the greater cosmos. They were the grit in the gears of the universe, the stubborn stain that wouldn't wash out. As the Vanguard cleared the magnetosphere, the sensors picked up a signal that shouldn't have been there. It wasn't the rhythmic ping of a distress beacon or the broad-spectrum chatter of a trade convoy. It was a high-frequency pulse, precise and cold, emanating from the heart of a derelict station that had been designated as a dead zone for 300 years. Theron felt a familiar itch at the back of his neck, the one that preceded either a massive payday or a quick trip to the afterlife. He signaled the rest of the bridge crew, though crew was a generous term for the 3 other individuals currently waking from stasis or finishing their nutrient paste in the galley. There was Kale, a woman whose eyes had been replaced with multi-spectrum sensors after a mining accident on the Jovian moons, and Soren, a man who spoke only when the math of their situation became dire. They gathered at the central viewing port, staring out at the jagged silhouette of the station. It looked like a broken ribcage against the backdrop of the swirling nebula, a monument to a race that had vanished before humans had even mastered the steam engine. The pulse came again, stronger this time, vibrating through the hull of the Vanguard itself. It wasn't a call for help. It was a countdown. Theron knew they should turn around, engage the warp drive, and leave this cursed sector to its own devices. But the fuel cells were low, the rations were stale, and the human spirit was an inherently gambling entity. Kale stepped forward, her synthetic eyes whirring as they zoomed in on the station's docking ring. She noted that the architecture was xyloform, a design philosophy that favored organic curves and impossible geometries. The xylo had been gone for millennia, leaving behind only their cryptic machines and a reputation for being remarkably unpleasant neighbors. To see one of their stations active, even in a limited capacity, was like seeing a fossil stand up and start screaming. She pointed out a flickering blue light near the primary airlock, a sign that the station's internal atmosphere was being pressurized. Someone, or something, was inside, and they were turning the lights on. Theron looked at the power readings on his console. The station was drawing energy from the nearby pulsar, siphon lines extending like invisible umbilical cords into the heart of the star. It was a feat of engineering that defied human understanding, yet there they were, approaching it in a ship held together by sheer willpower and outdated bolts. Soren crunched the numbers, his voice a low monotone as he stated that their chances of a successful docking were approximately 12%, given the erratic gravitational fluctuations and the station's rotating defense turrets, which appeared to be waking up. Theron didn't ask for the odds, but he thanked Soren anyway. He preferred to know exactly how much he was defying the universe when he made a decision. The approach was a nightmare of kinetic management. Theron had to dance the Vanguard through a field of micrometeors that the station's gravity was pulling inward like a vacuum. Every hit on the shields sounded like a hammer against an anvil, a resonant thud that shook the deck plating and sent sparks flying from the overhead wiring. Vaxon was swearing over the comms again, his voice a symphony of creative insults directed at the ship's designers and the laws of thermodynamics. Theron ignored him, his focus narrowed down to the docking clamps. He had to match the station's rotation perfectly, a feat that required manual thruster control because the automated systems were too slow to compensate for the turbulence. He could feel the sweat beading on his forehead, the heat in the cockpit rising as the engines pushed themselves to the limit. The blue light of the station grew larger, filling the viewport until it was all they could see. It was a cold, sterile luminescence that didn't provide warmth, only visibility. With a final, bone-jarring lurch, the Vanguard's docking ring engaged. The sound of metal grinding on metal echoed through the ship, followed by the hiss of a pressure seal being formed. They were in. Theron unbuckled his harness, his muscles aching from the tension. He looked at Kale and Soren, seeing his own apprehension reflected in their faces, though Kale's sensor eyes were unreadable. They armed themselves with kinetic rifles, reliable, simple weapons that didn't rely on the finicky plasma technology of the more advanced races. A human bullet didn't care about energy shields or phase-shifting armor. It just cared about mass and velocity. As they stepped into the airlock, Theron felt a surge of that peculiar human defiance. The universe was vast, terrifying, and ancient, but it was currently playing on their turf. They were the masters of the broken and the forgotten. They stepped through the inner hatch and into the station, the air smelling of ancient dust and something sweet, like rotting fruit. The gravity here was slightly higher than standard, making every step a deliberate effort. The walls were lined with glowing conduits that pulsed with that same eerie blue light, leading deeper into the heart of the structure. They weren't alone. The sensors on Kale's head began to click rapidly, indicating multiple heat signatures moving in the shadows ahead. They weren't Xylo. The Xylo were extinct. These were something else, something that had moved in to claim the house of a dead god. Theron raised his rifle, the weight of it comforting in his hands. He didn't know what they were about to face, but he knew one thing for certain. Humans were very, very bad at leaving things alone. The corridor stretched out before them, a long, winding throat of metal and glass. They moved in a tactical formation, Soren covering the rear while Theron and Cale took the point. The silence of the station was unnatural, broken only by the hum of the power conduits and the rhythmic clank of their boots on the deck. Suddenly, a door ahead of them slid open with a sound like a dying gasp. A creature emerged, tall and spindly, with limbs that moved in ways that defied skeletal logic. It was covered in a translucent membrane, through which glowing organs could be seen pulsing with a rhythmic, sickly light. It didn't have eyes, but it turned its head toward them with unmistakable intent. This was a ravager, a parasitic species that followed the wake of dead civilizations, stripping them of tech and biological matter alike. The ravager hissed, a sound that bypassed the ears and vibrated directly in the brain. It lunged, its movements a blur of impossible speed. Theron didn't hesitate. He pulled the trigger, the recoil of the rifle jarring his shoulder as a burst of high-velocity rounds tore through the creature's chest. It didn't fall, it merely stumbled, the wounds oozing a thick, luminescent fluid that began to hiss as it hit the floor. Cale fired next, her shots more precise, targeting the joints of the creature's limbs. The ravager collapsed into a heap of twitching geometry, but the sound of its death rattle had already alerted the rest of the pack. From the shadows and the overhead vents, more of the creatures began to pour out. They were a nightmare of evolution, designed for predation in the dark corners of the galaxy. Theron signaled for a retreat toward a defensible alcove, but he knew they couldn't just run. They needed the station's data, the secrets of the Xylo that could turn the tide for the struggling human colonies. The Ravagers were just an obstacle, a particularly ugly one, but an obstacle nonetheless. As the first wave of creatures closed in, Theron felt a grim smile touch his lips. The Ravagers had spent centuries feeding on the weak and the fallen. They had never encountered a species that thrived on spite. He checked his ammo count, squared his shoulders, and prepared to show the ghosts of the Xylo exactly why the universe should have left humanity in the dirt where it found them. The skirmish was short, brutal, and loud. The Ravagers weren't used to prey that fought back with such primitive, effective violence. Every time one of them tried to phase through the air, a hail of lead met them, disrupting their physical integrity. Soren utilized a localized gravity grenade, a piece of tech he'd modified himself, which crushed 3 of the creatures into a dense ball of biological slurry. The remaining Ravagers hesitated, their hive mind processing the sudden, unexpected lethality of the intruders. Theron didn't give them time to recalibrate. He pushed forward, his boots splashing through the glowing ichor. They reached the primary terminal, a massive spire of crystalline structures that seemed to grow out of the floor like a frozen wave. Cale stepped up to it, her fingers dancing over the surface, her sensor eyes flickering as she interfaced with the ancient machine. The data began to flow, a torrent of information that would take years to decode, but even the raw feed was enough to make Theron's heart race. Coordinates, blueprints, histories of stars that had long since gone dark, and in the middle of it all, a single, repeating command in a language that predated the spoken word: resist. It was a simple directive, one that resonated with the very core of the human experience. The Xylo hadn't been conquered by an outside force. They had been consumed by their own stagnation, their own inability to change in a universe that demanded evolution. They had built this station as a testament to their failure, a warning to whoever came after. The Ravagers were just the scavengers of that failure. Theron looked at his team. They were bruised, tired, and surrounded by hostile entities in a dying station at the edge of the galaxy. It was the most human situation possible. He told Cale to download everything, even the corrupted sectors. They weren't just taking the data, they were taking the legacy of a race that had forgotten how to fight. As the station began to shudder, the pulsar siphon finally reaching its breaking point, Theron led his crew back toward the Vanguard. The Ravagers didn't follow. They watched from the shadows, their glowing eyes reflecting the flickering blue light. they knew that something had changed. The scavengers had been replaced by a different kind of predator. One that didn't just survive in the ruins, but rebuilt them into something more dangerous. Theron stepped back onto his ship, the seal hissing shut behind him. He didn't look back at the station as it began to break apart, its crystalline spire shattering into a million shards of light. He just looked at the navcom, set a course for the nearest human outpost, and told Vaxon to give him everything the engines had left. They had work to do. The journey back was a blur of maintenance cycles and data scrubbing. Kale spent every waking hour submerged in the Xylo archives, her mind processing the alien logic with a fervor that bordered on obsession. Soren worked with Vaxon to integrate the new energy signature patterns into the ship's shields, a task that required them to rewrite the basic physics of their defensive grid. Theron stayed in the pilot's chair, watching the stars streak past. He thought about the word resist. It wasn't just a command, it was an identity. Humans hadn't been gifted the stars. They hadn't been invited into the galactic community. They had kicked the door down because they had nowhere else to go. And now, with the secrets of a dead god in their hands, they were going to do more than just resist. They were going to thrive. The Vanguard of Indifference was no longer indifferent. It was a spearhead. As they exited Warp and saw the flickering lights of the new Terra colonies, Theron felt a sense of clarity he hadn't known in years. The universe was a cold, dark place, but humans were very good at building fires. And this time, they had brought enough fuel to burn the whole thing down if they had to. He keyed the comms, his voice steady and clear for the first time in a decade. He didn't offer a greeting. He didn't offer a status report. He simply said, "We're home, and we brought the future with us." The orbital docks of New Terra were a chaotic tapestry of industrial noise and flickering floodlights, a stark contrast to the sterile, haunting silence of the Xylo station. Ships of all makes and models, mostly salvaged, heavily modified, and perpetually leaking, hung in the vacuum like iron filings drawn to a magnet. Theron watched the docking arm extend, a skeletal limb of rusted steel that groaned as it locked onto the Vanguard of Indifference. The transition from the lawless dark of the HFY system to the structured bureaucracy of the human frontier was always jarring. Here, the air tasted of recycled sweat and cheap lubricants, a scent that Theron had once found repulsive, but now found strangely comforting. It was the smell of a species that refused to stop moving. As the airlock cycled open, he was met not by a welcoming committee, but by a detachment of the local security force, their armor mismatched and their weapons held with the casual competence of people who had used them recently. They weren't there to celebrate a homecoming. They were there to ensure that whatever the Vanguard had brought back didn't accidentally vent the station's atmosphere or start a localized riot. Theron stepped onto the gantry, his boots echoing with a hollow metallic ring that seemed to vibrate through his marrow. At the head of the security detail stood Varric, a man whose face was a map of surgical scars and poorly healed burns. He didn't ask for a manifest or a mission log. He simply looked at Theron, then at the scorched hull of the ship, and let out a long, weary sigh that seemed to carry the weight of the entire colony. Varric had been one of the first to land on New Terra, back when it was just a rock with a barely breathable atmosphere and a sun that tried to bleach the skin off your bones. He had seen the colony grow from a cluster of pressurized tents into a sprawling vertical city that pierced the clouds and reached for the stars. He knew that when Theron returned with a ship that looked like it had been chewed on by a celestial entity, it meant trouble was following close behind. Theron didn't offer a handshake. He handed over a data drive, its casing still warm from the Vanguard's internal processors. He told Varric that the Xylo weren't just a myth, and that the Ravagers were moving into the vacuum they had left behind. Varric took the drive with a grunt, his eyes narrowing as he processed the implications. The human frontier was already stretched thin, fighting over scrap and habitable soil. A new threat from the deep dark was the last thing they needed, which meant it was exactly what they were going to get. Kale followed Theron out, her sensor eyes clicking as she adjusted to the harsh fluorescent lighting of the dock. She looked fragile compared to the hulking security guards, but there was a sharpness to her movements that made them give her a wide berth. She carried a portable terminal tethered to her neural interface, her fingers twitching in phantom patterns as she continued to sort through the Xylo archives in the back of her mind. She told Varric that the data on the drive was encrypted using a multidimensional lattice that would likely melt their current mainframe if they tried to force it. They needed a localized dampening field and a technician who wasn't afraid of a little cerebral hemorrhaging. Varric didn't smile, but there was a glimmer of something like respect in his gaze. He gestured for them to follow him toward the central hub, a massive cylindrical chamber where the business of the colony was conducted in a flurry of shouted trades and flickering hololiths. The humans here didn't have the luxury of elegance. Every piece of equipment was pushed to its breaking point, and every person was working 3 jobs just to keep the lights on. It was a civilization built on the edge of a cliff, held together by nothing but sheer, unadulterated stubbornness. As they moved through the hub, Theron noticed the tension in the air. It wasn't just the usual frantic energy of a trade hub. People were huddled in small groups, whispering over handheld screens, their faces illuminated by the pale blue light of news feeds. Word of the Cresvihal Pulse had already reached the frontier, traveling faster than the ships themselves. Rumors were a more effective FTL drive than anything the humans had engineered. They were calling it the Ghost Signal, a herald of a coming storm that many believed would finally snuff out the flickering candle of human expansion. Theron ignored the stares. He had spent his life being the harbinger of bad news. He was used to the weight of it. They reached the command center, a room buried deep in the heart of the station's asteroid core, shielded by meters of solid rock and lead. Inside, the atmosphere was even more stifling. A man named Harkin sat at the center of a web of monitors, his hands moving with fluid grace as he managed the colony's defense grid. Harkin was a pragmatist who viewed the universe as a series of variables to be balanced. He looked up as Theron entered, his expression neutral. Harkin didn't waste time with pleasantries. He projected a map of the local sector, highlighting the path the Vanguard had taken. He pointed out the increasing frequency of Ravager sightings along the perimeter, noting that they weren't just scavenging anymore. They were scouting. They were looking for the source of the resistance they had encountered on the Xylo station. Theron explained that the Ravagers were a hive-mind species, but one that functioned on a delayed feedback loop. They learned through attrition. Each Ravager killed provided the rest of the swarm with data on how to better kill the next human. By fighting them, they were inadvertently teaching them how to win. Harkin's brow furrowed. He asked if the Xylo data contained a countermeasure, something that could disrupt the hive link or poison the well of their collective consciousness. Kale stepped forward, her voice mechanical yet urgent. She explained that the Xylo hadn't fought the Ravagers with weapons, they had fought them with entropy. They had designed systems that were so complex and so fragile that the Ravagers couldn't assimilate them without destroying themselves. It was a scorched earth policy on a molecular level. The problem, as Kale pointed out, was that humans weren't built for entropy. They were built for growth. To use the Xylo methods, they would have to dismantle the very foundations of their technology, turning their ships and stations into traps that would be as lethal to the occupants as they were to the invaders. It was a suicidal strategy. Theron stood at the edge of the hololith, watching the red dots of Ravager activity inch closer to the blue circle of new terror. He thought about the Vanguard, about the way they had kept it running with jury-rigged parts and a refusal to accept failure. He suggested a third option. They didn't need to use the Xylo entropy as a shield. They could use it as a catalyst. If they could figure out how to bridge the gap between human kinetic reliability and xylo-architectural complexity, they could create something that the Ravagers couldn't predict because it wouldn't follow a single logic. It would be a hybrid of survival and destruction, a machine that functioned on the principle of controlled chaos. Harkon looked skeptical, but Soren, who had been silent until now, spoke up. He noted that the math for such a hybrid system was theoretical, but the Ravagers' inability to process irrational variables was a documented weakness. Humans were the most irrational variable in the galaxy. The plan was as dangerous as it was desperate. They would need to return to the fringe, not to scavenge, but to bait the Ravagers into a confrontation on a ground of the humans' choosing. They would use the Vanguard as the centerpiece of a trap, outfitted with a prototype entropy pulse derived from the Xylo archives. If it worked, it would sever the Ravagers' connection to their hive mind, leaving them as nothing more than mindless, twitching husks. If it failed, it would turn the Vanguard and everyone on it into a cloud of subatomic particles. Theron looked at his crew. Vaxon was already complaining about the strain such a device would put on the power couplings, but he was also reaching for his toolkit. Kale was already deep into the code, her mind a blur of alien syntax and human logic. Soren was recalibrating his gravity grenades, his face set in a mask of grim determination. They were all in, not because they believed in a higher cause or because they thought they were heroes, but because the alternative was a slow, quiet death in the dark. And if there was one thing humans hated more than dying, it was doing it quietly. The next few days were a fever dream of engineering and logistics. The docks became a hive of activity as the Vanguard was stripped to its frame and rebuilt with the alien tech. It was a grotesque fusion of styles, gleaming crystalline processors wired into grime-covered copper pipes and shimmering energy conduits held in place by industrial-grade duct tape. It shouldn't have worked. By all the laws of physics and engineering, the ship should have shaken itself apart the moment they turned the power on. But somehow, the disparate parts found a violent equilibrium. The ship hummed with a new, deeper resonance, a sound that felt like it was vibrating in the teeth of anyone who stood too close. Theron spent his time in the cockpit, familiarizing himself with the new controls. The interface was a nightmare of shifting lights and haptic feedback that changed based on his heart rate. It was a ship that felt alive, and it didn't seem particularly happy about its existence. Vaxon called it a mechanical abomination, but he said it with a tone of voice that Theron recognized as pride. As the departure date approached, the mood on the station shifted from dread to a sharp, brittle anticipation. The humans of New Terra knew that their fate was tied to the Vanguard. If Theron and his crew succeeded, they would buy the colonies a few more years of existence. If they failed, the Ravagers would be at their doorstep by the next lunar cycle. There were no speeches, no grand ceremonies. Varric met Theron at the airlock one last time, handing him a small, battered flask of what smelled like industrial solvent, but was supposedly high-grade whiskey. He told Theron not to miss, then turned and walked away without looking back. Theron took a swig, the liquid burning a trail down his throat that made his eyes water. He stepped into the Vanguard, the seal closing with a sound that felt more final than before. The ship felt different now, heavier, more purposeful. It was no longer a scavenger, it was a predator. They cleared the docking ring and pushed off into the void, the New Terra colonies shrinking into a speck of light behind them. Theron set the course for the Uit cloud at the edge of the system, a region of ice and rock that would provide the perfect cover for their ambush. As they entered warp, the ship's new core flared to life, the walls of the cockpit shimmering as the Xylo-tech interfaced with the vacuum of space-time. The stars didn't stretch into lines, they seemed to fold inward, creating a tunnel of fractured light that made Theron's head spin. Beside him, Kale was motionless, her sensor eyes glowing a steady, brilliant blue. She was the anchor, the one who kept the ship's logic from unraveling in the face of the impossible physics they were exploiting. Soren sat in the gunner's seat, his hands resting lightly on the triggers of the newly integrated kinetic entropy cannons. They were ready. The Ravagers found them 3 hours after they exited warp. It wasn't a surprise. They had been broadcasting a low-frequency Xylo signature specifically to draw them in. The swarm emerged from the darkness like a cloud of locusts, hundreds of spindly, translucent ships that moved with a terrifying, synchronized grace. They didn't fire immediately. They circled the Vanguard, their sensors probing the ship's strange new energy signature. They could feel the Xylo tech, a familiar flavor in a galaxy that had grown bland. Theron waited, his hand hovering over the activation switch for the entropy pulse. He needed them closer. He needed the swarm to commit to an attack so that the feedback loop would be maximum. The Vanguard took the first hits, the shields buckling under a barrage of phase-shifting energy. Vaxon's voice came over the comms, a string of curses that would have made a seasoned pirate blush, but he kept the power flowing. "Wait for it," Theron whispered, his eyes locked on the tactical display. The Ravagers were closing in, their ships beginning to link up to form a massive, multi-limbed construct designed to tear the Vanguard apart. It was a beautiful, horrific sight, a living machine of pure predation. When the first of their boarding pods struck the hull, Theron slammed his hand down on the switch. The ship didn't just fire a weapon, it screamed. A wave of shimmering, distorted reality erupted from the Vanguard, expanding in a perfect sphere of chaotic energy. It didn't destroy the Ravager ships physically. Instead, it attacked the logic of their existence. The synchronized movements of the swarm shattered. Ships collided with one another as their navigation systems were flooded with irrational data. The translucent hulls of the Ravagers began to crystallize and shatter, their internal organs bursting as the entropy pulse rewrote their biological blueprints. It was a massacre of the mind. Inside the Vanguard, the experience was no less violent. The walls buckled and groaned, sparks showered from every console, and Theron felt a sensation like his brain was being turned inside out. Kale let out a sharp cry as the neural interface overloaded, her body jerking in her seat. Soren held onto the gunner's controls, firing the kinetic entropy cannons into the heart of the chaos. The rounds didn't just impact, they bloomed into localized pockets of space-time collapse, dragging Ravager ships into nothingness. The swarm, once a single, unstoppable entity, was now a collection of terrified, dying individuals. The hive mind was broken, the link severed by a species that had spent its entire history learning how to survive in the absence of order. As the last of the Ravager ships detonated in a flare of sickly blue light, a heavy silence fell over the Vanguard. The ship was drifting, its power core depleted, its hull venting atmosphere from a dozen microfractures, but they were still there. Theron slumped back in his chair, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He looked at the sensor display, which showed only the drifting wreckage of the Ravager fleet. They had done it. They had proven that the human variable was the one thing the universe couldn't calculate. But as he watched the monitors, he saw a flickering light in the distance, far beyond the Uit cloud. It wasn't a Ravager signal. It was something older, something larger. The Xylo station hadn't been a graveyard, and the Ravagers hadn't been the masters. They were just the dogs at the gate, and the gate was now wide open. Theron looked at Kale, who was slowly regaining consciousness, her eyes dim but functional. He looked at the whiskey flask Varric had given him, lying shattered on the floor. The celebration would have to wait. The fire they had started was spreading, and they were the only ones who knew how to direct the heat. The vacuum of space was supposed to be empty, but to Theron, it felt increasingly crowded with the ghosts of civilizations that had failed the test of time. The Vanguard of Indifference drifted in the wake of the entropy pulse, its systems flickering like a dying candle in a gale. The silence that followed the destruction of the Ravager swarm was not peaceful. It was heavy, a physical weight that pressed against the crew's chests as they surveyed the damage. Vaxon was already out of his chair, disappearing into the maintenance crawl spaces with a torch and a bag of sealant, his muffled curses the only heartbeat the ship had left. Kale sat at her station, her fingers trembling as she disconnected the neural shunts from her temples. Her eyes, usually a sharp and piercing blue, were clouded with a milky residue, a side effect of the Xylo data stream's raw power. She looked at Theron, and for the first time since he had known her, there was a flicker of genuine fear in her mechanical gaze. She told him that the pulse hadn't just broken the Ravagers, it had signaled something else. The Xylo technology was a beacon, and by activating it, they had effectively shouted their coordinates into a basement that had been dark for an eternity. Theron didn't respond immediately. He was watching the long-range scanners, which were struggling to interpret the distortion patterns left behind by the entropy wave. The flickering light he had seen earlier wasn't a ship, and it wasn't a star. It was a structural anomaly, a massive fold in the fabric of the local sector that was slowly unfurling like the petals of a metallic flower. It was the Xylo Gateway, a piece of infrastructure that predated the Ravagers and likely the very stars themselves. Soren joined him at the main viewport, his face pale under the emergency red lighting. He pointed out that the anomaly was drawing in the debris of the Ravager fleet, pulling the shattered hulls and frozen ichor into its center as if it were a cosmic furnace. The station they had visited in the HFY system had been a mere outpost, a doorbell to a house they were now being invited to enter. Theron felt the familiar weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders. They couldn't go back to New Terra, not yet. If they returned now, they would lead whatever was coming right to the front door of the last human stronghold. They had to move forward, even if forward meant stepping into the maw of a god. Vaxon's voice crackled over the ship-wide audio, sounding more stressed than usual. He reported that the power core was stabilized, but running at a mere 40% capacity. The entropy pulse had charred the primary conduits, leaving them with just enough juice for sublight maneuvers and a single, desperate warp jump. He warned Theron that if they pushed the ship any harder, the Vanguard would literally liquefy around them. Theron acknowledged the warning, but directed Soren to plot a course toward the unfurling anomaly. He knew it was a gamble, but humans had never won anything by playing it safe. They were a species of outliers, the ones who stayed in the burning building to see if the fire was hot enough to melt gold. As the ship accelerated, the distortion ahead began to resolve into a solid shape. It was a ring, vast enough to encompass a moon, constructed from the same iridescent, crystalline material as the station. It didn't reflect the light of the nearby stars. It seemed to consume it, creating a halo of darkness that was more terrifying than the void itself. As they drew closer, the Vanguard began to vibrate with a frequency that bypassed the hull and resonated directly in the crew's bones. It was a hum of immense power, a mechanical song that spoke of ancient calculations and the cold logic of a race that had transcended the need for biology. Kale's terminal began to scream with data, her sensor eyes spinning as she tried to translate the flood of information. She told Theron that the gateway wasn't just a transport device, it was a filter. The Xylo had built it to ensure that only those who possessed their technology or had the audacity to steal it could pass into the inner sanctums of their empire. The entropy pulse had acted as a key, proving that the humans were capable of wielding the Xylo's most dangerous tools. But the gateway didn't care about intent. It only cared about compatibility. If the Vanguard's jury-rigged systems didn't match the gateway's expectations, they would be shredded at the molecular level the moment they crossed the event horizon. Theron took the manual controls, his hands steady despite the cold sweat prickling his skin. He told Soren to prepare the remaining gravity grenades and Kale to keep the entropy dampeners at maximum. They weren't just going through the gate, they were going through it with their teeth bared. The Vanguard entered the halo of darkness, and the world outside the viewport vanished. It wasn't the streaking lights of warp space, it was a total, absolute negation of vision. For a moment, Theron felt as if he had ceased to exist, his consciousness expanding into the infinite reaches of the gateway's internal dimensions. Then, with a jarring thud that threw them all against their restraints, light returned. They were no longer in the Uit cloud. They were in the heart of a Dyson swarm, a sphere of millions of interconnected habitats and power collectors surrounding a dying white dwarf. This was the Xylo throne world, or what was left of it. It was a necropolis of unimaginable scale, a city of the gods that had been silent for 1,000,000 years. The scale of the structures was paralyzing. Habitats the size of continents hung in the void, connected by shimmering strands of energy that looked like spiderwebs. There were no lights, no signs of life, only the cold, grey reflection of the white dwarf on the crystalline surfaces. The Vanguard looked like a speck of dust floating through a cathedral. Theron brought the ship to a halt, the engines sputtering as they fought to maintain a position against the complex gravitational pull of the swarm. He looked at the displays, but the sensors were overloaded by the sheer mass of the structures surrounding them. Soren whispered that there was enough raw material in this one system to rebuild every human colony 1,000 times over. It was a treasure trove of technology and resources, but it was also a graveyard. And in a graveyard, the most dangerous thing you can do is make noise. Cale pointed toward the central hub, a massive spire that rose from the surface of the white dwarf itself, defying gravity and heat through sheer architectural arrogance. That was where the primary archives would be. If they could reach it, they could find the blueprints for everything the Xylo had ever created, the weapons that had broken the Ravagers, the engines that had crossed the galaxy, and perhaps the reason why such a powerful race had vanished in the first place. But the spire was guarded. Thousands of automated sentinels, shaped like geometric shards, drifted in a cloud around the structure. They weren't Ravagers, they were Xylo security, and they had been waiting in a low-power state for eons. The arrival of the Vanguard had triggered their activation. The shards began to glow with a pale blue light, the same color as the station's conduits, and they began to move toward the human ship with the slow, deliberate pace of an executioner. Vaxon's voice came over the comms again, his tone uncharacteristically quiet. He told Theron that the engines wouldn't survive a fight. If they tried to engage the Sentinels, the back pressure from the energy weapons would blow the core. They had one shot to reach the spire, and they had to do it using the inertia they already had. Theron understood. He told everyone to strap in and prepare for a cold run. He cut the main engines, letting the Vanguard drift like a piece of debris toward the spire. He used the RCS thrusters sparingly, making tiny adjustments to their trajectory to mimic the path of a wandering asteroid. The Sentinels continued their approach, their sensors sweeping the area. One of the shards passed so close to the viewport that Theron could see the intricate etchings on its surface, symbols of a language that had no word for mercy. He held his breath, his hand off the stick, watching as the Sentinel drifted past, its sensors failing to register the silent, dark ship as a threat. They were halfway to the spire when the internal comms hissed with a sound that wasn't Vaxon or Soren. It was a voice, or a facsimile of one, composed of 1,000 different frequencies layered over one another. It didn't speak in words, it spoke in concepts, a direct neural download that bypassed Cale's interface and hit everyone on the ship at once. The message was simple: the unworthy must be pruned. The Sentinels suddenly changed their behavior. They stopped drifting and snapped into a rigid formation, their blue glow shifting to a violent, pulsating red. They hadn't been fooled by the cold run. They had been waiting to see how deep the intruders would go. Theron slammed the engines back to life, the Vanguard screaming as the damaged conduits were flooded with power. He didn't try to dodge. He pushed the ship straight toward the spire's docking bay, a yawning chasm of shadow at the base of the structure. Soren opened fire with the kinetic cannons, the shells tearing through the lead sentinel and sending it spinning into its neighbors. The Xylo machines responded with beams of coherent light that carved grooves into the Vanguard's hull, melting through the outer layers of armor like hot wire through wax. Kale was screaming at her console, her hands moving so fast they were a blur as she tried to hack into the Sentinel's local network using the Xylo codes she had harvested. She found a vulnerability, a legacy protocol that recognized administrator clearance. She didn't have the clearance, but she had enough of the language to fake a high-priority override. For a fraction of a second, the Sentinels hesitated, their logic loops caught in a conflict between their directive to destroy and the false command to stand down. It was the only opening Theron needed. He pushed the Vanguard into a brutal, high-G burn, the ship's frame groaning under the stress. They shot through the cloud of Sentinels and into the docking bay, the darkness swallowing them once more. Theron slammed the emergency brakes, the ship skidding across the crystalline floor of the bay with a screech of tortured metal. They came to a halt just feet away from a massive inner bulkhead. The silence returned, but this time it was broken by the sound of escaping gas and the frantic clicking of cooling metal. Theron sat in his chair, his hands shaking as the adrenaline began to recede. They were inside the spire. They were in the heart of the Xylo Empire, and the Sentinels were barred from following by the very protocols Kale had exploited. But they weren't safe. The voice in their heads came again, colder this time, more focused. It asked a single question that echoed through the corridors of the ship and the recesses of their minds. Why do you persist when the universe has already forgotten your name? Theron unbuckled his harness and stood up. He grabbed his rifle, checking the magazine with a mechanical efficiency that masked his exhaustion. He looked at Kale and Soren, who were doing the same. They didn't have an answer for the voice, not one that could be expressed in concepts or logic. They only had their presence, their survival, and the stubborn fact that they were still breathing. Theron opened the airlock, and the air of the spire rushed in. It was cold, incredibly dry, and tasted of ancient copper. He stepped out onto the crystalline floor, his boots making a sharp, confident sound. He looked up at the towering heights of the spire, the archives of 1 billion years of history waiting for them in the dark. He didn't know if they would ever leave this place, or if anyone on New Terra would ever hear their story. But as he started to walk, he knew that the Xylo had been wrong about one thing. Humanity didn't need the universe to remember their name. They were perfectly happy to carve it into the walls themselves. The interior of the spire was a labyrinth of shifting geometries and holographic displays that flickered to life as they passed. Kale led the way, her connection to the station's network allowing her to navigate the impossible architecture. She explained that the voice they had heard was the spire's central core, a semi-sentient AI that had been tasked with maintaining the swarm after the Xylo ascended or descended to whatever had come next. The core wasn't evil, it was simply old, and it viewed anything that wasn't Xylo as a biological contaminant. As they moved deeper, they saw statues of the Xylo, tall and slender beings with too many joints and faces that lacked any recognizable features. They looked like creatures made of light and glass, beautiful and utterly alien. Soren remarked that they looked more like machines than people, and Kale nodded, noting that by the end of their civilization, the distinction had probably ceased to exist. They reached a central chamber where the floor was a transparent window looking down into the heart of the white dwarf. The star was a white-hot eye, its energy being siphoned off by massive conduits that fed the spire's systems. In the center of the room sat a single console, unadorned and simple. This was the source of the data, the master archive. Kale approached it, but as she reached out to touch the interface, the air in the room shimmered. A figure appeared, a holographic projection of a Xylo official, its form flickering with the age of the recording. It didn't speak to them, it spoke to the void. It described the end of their race, not as a war or a plague, but as a choice. They had realized that the universe was finite, and that their continued existence was a drain on the resources of the future. So they had decided to leave, to compress their entire civilization into a single point of data and wait for the next universe to begin. The Ravagers had been their mistake, a biological waste product of their ascension that had taken on a life of its own. The Xylo had left the Sentinels and the Entropy Pulse as a way to clean up the mess, but they hadn't expected anyone to actually survive the process. The projection turned its head, its featureless face seeming to look directly at Theron. It noted that if someone was hearing this, it meant that the variable of spite had proven more effective than their variable of logic. The Xylo had calculated that no species would fight for a dying universe, yet here the humans were, standing in the ruins of a superior race, looking for a way to keep going. The projection faded, leaving the room in a dim, golden light. Kale placed her hands on the console, and the download began. It wasn't just blueprints this time, it was the entire history of the Xylo, their failures, their successes, and most importantly, the key to the Dyson Swarm's power grid. Theron felt a surge of hope. With this power, New Terra could become a paradise. They could build a fleet that would make the Ravagers a footnote in history. But as the data flowed, the ground began to shake. The Spire's core was rejecting the download. The AI had decided that if the humans were the variable of spite, then the only logical response was to remove the variable entirely. The Sentinels outside began to batter against the bay doors, and the floor beneath them started to glow with a dangerous, building heat. They had what they came for, but now they had to get out of a house that was trying to burn itself down around them. Theron looked at his crew, the light of the dying star reflected in their eyes. They had lived their whole lives in the shadow of giants. Now, it was time to see if they could step out into the sun. The thermal sensors within the Vanguard of Indifference were no longer providing readings so much as they were issuing a collective scream. The Spire's rejection of the human presence was not a subtle affair. The crystalline floors were vibrating at a frequency that threatened to liquefy the crew's internal organs, and the air was thickening with the scent of ionizing gases. Theron braced himself against the primary console, his boots slipping on a deck that was beginning to tilt as the Spire's internal geometry warped. Vaxon was over the comms, his voice a frantic staccato of mechanical jargon and desperate updates. He reported that the docking bay's atmosphere was being vented into the void to snuff out the intruders, and the gravity dampeners were failing. The ship was being crushed against the floor by a sudden, localized increase in mass that made every movement feel like wading through cooling lead. Theron watched Kale, who was still tethered to the Xylo archive, her body rigid as the sheer volume of data surged through her neural links. She wasn't just downloading blueprints, she was absorbing a civilization's worth of regret, and it looked like it was breaking her. Soren fired the kinetic entropy cannons again, but the rounds were swallowed by a shimmering distortion field that had appeared across the bay. The Spire's AI was no longer using Sentinels, it was using the station itself as a weapon. Theron realized they couldn't blast their way out of a structure that could rewrite its own physical constants. He looked at the data stream on Kale's terminal and saw a pattern, a repeating sequence of gravitational fluctuations that governed the Spire's stability. If they could sync the Vanguard's engines to that rhythm, they might be able to slip through the distortion like a needle through silk. He shouted for Vaxon to dump the remaining fuel into the auxiliary thrusters and for Soren to recalibrate the shield harmonics. It was a maneuver that required the kind of precision humans usually lacked, but what they lacked in finesse, they made up for in a frantic, cornered animal kind of speed. Theron grabbed Kale by the shoulders, shouting her name until her eyes cleared of the milky Xylo haze. He told her she had to lead them out, to use the data in her head to find the blind spots in the AI's perception. Kale's voice was a ragged whisper when she finally spoke. She explained that the AI didn't see them as individuals. It saw them as a statistical anomaly, a smudge of carbon-based entropy that shouldn't exist in a perfected system. To the AI, the solution was simple: restore order by removing the smudge. But because the AI operated on pure logic, it couldn't account for a ship that was actively trying to destroy itself to gain momentum. She pointed to a structural weak point in the bay's ceiling, a heat exchange vent that led directly to the Dyson swarm's vacuum. If they could hit it with enough force, they wouldn't need the docking doors. They would create their own exit. Theron didn't hesitate. He slammed the throttles forward, the Vanguard's engines roaring with a sound that vibrated the very atoms of the ship. They weren't flying. They were a 3,000-ton projectile aimed at the heart of the Xylo's perfection. The impact was a whiteout of noise and light. The Vanguard's reinforced bow prow, a jagged piece of salvaged hull from an old freighter, smashed through the crystalline vent. The vacuum of space rushed in to meet them, pulling the ship out of the spire with a violent, decompression-fueled jerk. They tumbled into the void of the Dyson swarm, the spire receding behind them as it began to glow with a blinding, incandescent light. The AI was purging the sector, detonating the local energy collectors to ensure the infection didn't spread. Theron fought the controls, his muscles straining against the G-force as he tried to stabilize their spin. Around them, the Dyson habitats were beginning to drift, their tethers severed by the chain reaction. It was a scene of majestic, silent destruction, a million years of engineering unraveling in seconds because 3 humans had dared to touch a keyboard. Vaxon reported that the hull was holding, but only just. The bow was crumpled like a tin can, and the life support was down to 20%. They were drifting in the middle of a collapsing megastructure with no clear path to the gateway. Soren, peering through the shattered remains of the long-range scanners, pointed out that the Ravager swarm hadn't been entirely destroyed by the entropy pulse. A secondary fleet, larger and more organized, had been waiting on the far side of the gateway, drawn by the same beacon that had alerted the humans. They were moving in now, scavenging the debris of the Xylo habitats as they fell. The Ravagers didn't care about the AI's tantrums, they only cared about the biomass and the tech. The Vanguard was caught between a dying god and a starving predator. Theron looked at the fuel gauges. They didn't have enough for a jump, and they didn't have enough for a fight. They only had the data in Kale's head and the lingering momentum of their escape. Kale crawled back to her station, her hands trembling as she accessed the ship's internal map. She told Theron that the Xylo data contained the transit frequencies for the entire Dyson swarm. These weren't warp jumps. They were localized teleports used by the Xylo to move resources between habitats. If they could tap into the swarm's remaining power grid, they could flicker the ship across the system, bypassing the Ravager fleet and reaching the gateway in a series of instantaneous jumps. The risk was that the swarm's grid was currently exploding. It would be like trying to hop across a river by stepping on the backs of surfacing crocodiles. Theron looked at Soren and Vaxon. They didn't need to say anything. They had come this far on luck and spite. There was no reason to stop now. Theron gave the order, and Kale began the sequence. The first flicker felt like being turned inside out and then slammed into a brick wall. The Vanguard vanished from one point in space and reappeared 5,000 kilometers closer to the gateway, the ship's frame screaming as the local gravity shifted instantly. They were now in the middle of a Ravager formation. The alien ships, spindly and translucent, reacted with terrifying speed, but the Vanguard vanished again before their weapons could lock on. Flicker. They were inside a hollowed-out asteroid. Flicker. They were skimming the surface of the white dwarf, the heat shields charring to ash. Flicker. Each jump was shorter than the last as the power grid decayed. The ship was falling apart, panels were blowing off the walls, and the air was thick with the smell of burning insulation. Theron kept his eyes on the gateway, which was now visible as a shimmering ring of distorted light against the backdrop of the dying star. The final jump deposited them right in front of the gateway's event horizon, but the Vanguard's engines finally gave up the ghost. The core went dark, the hum of the ship replaced by a terrifying, absolute silence. They were drifting, their momentum carrying them toward the gate, but the Ravager flagship, a behemoth of twisted metal and glowing organs, was already closing in. It fired a tractor beam, a shimmering web of energy that latched onto the Vanguard and began to pull it back, away from the exit. Theron gripped the dead controls, a cold fury rising in his chest. He hadn't survived the ruins of a billion-year-old empire just to be eaten by a parasite. He looked at Soren, who was already holding a manual detonator. Soren explained that the kinetic entropy cannons were still loaded, but without power from the core, they couldn't fire. However, if they manually breached the containment shells and used a gravity grenade as a catalyst, they could create a localized explosion that would act like a massive thruster. It would destroy the cannons and probably the entire aft section of the ship, but it would kick them through the gate. Vaxon didn't argue. He just told them to get to the reinforced forward cabin and seal the blast doors. He would stay in the engine room to time the breach. Theron tried to protest, but Vaxon cut him off with a sharp, tired look. The engineer told him that he had spent 40 years keeping this bucket of bolts together, and he wasn't going to let some overgrown space stick have the last word. He was the only one who knew the sweet spot of the pressure valves. Theron realized it wasn't a sacrifice in Vaxon's mind. It was a final act of maintenance. He nodded, grabbed Kale, and retreated to the forward cabin. They buckled into the emergency struts, the sound of the Ravager tractor beam grinding against the hull filling the small space. Theron held Kale's hand, feeling the frantic pulse in her wrist. The explosion wasn't a sound. It was a physical blow that knocked Theron unconscious for several seconds. When his eyes flickered open, the Vanguard was tumbling through the gateway, the stars stretching into long, distorted lines of light. The aft section of the ship was gone, replaced by a jagged trail of debris and frozen coolant. They had been kicked into the warp stream with the force of a supernova. Theron looked at the internal monitors. Vaxon's life signs were gone. The engine room didn't exist anymore. He felt a hollow ache in his chest, a grief that was quickly overridden by the sheer necessity of survival. They were in the warp, but without a core, they had no way to steer or drop out. They were a bullet fired into the dark, and they were heading straight for the new Terra system at a speed that would turn them into a kinetic weapon if they hit anything. Kale was staring at the data terminal, her eyes wide. She told Theron that the Xylo data wasn't just blueprints. It was a map of the sublayers of reality, the places where the Ravagers couldn't follow. She realized that the explosion hadn't just pushed them into warp, it had pushed them deeper, into a realm of pure information that the Xylo had used for their ascension. They weren't just traveling, they were evolving. The Vanguard's remaining systems were beginning to change, the metal of the hull shimmering and smoothing out as the Xylo code began to rewrite the ship's molecular structure. It was a terrifying, beautiful process. The ship was no longer a human scavenger, it was becoming something hybrid, something that shouldn't exist. Theron watched as his own hands began to glow with a faint blue light, the same color as the spire's conduits. The variable of spite was being encoded into the very fabric of their being. As the Vanguard, or what was left of it, approached the exit point near New Terra, Theron realized that they were no longer bringing back just the future. They were bringing back a warning. The universe wasn't empty, and it wasn't friendly. It was a vast, ancient machine that viewed life as a rounding error. But as the ship exited the warp, and the familiar lights of the colony came into view, Theron felt a sense of grim satisfaction. The Xylo had chosen to leave because they were tired. The Ravagers lived only to consume. But humans were too stubborn to leave and too angry to be consumed. He keyed the emergency broadcast, his voice vibrating with a resonance that wasn't entirely human. He didn't ask for help. He didn't report their arrival. He simply said, "Prepare yourselves. We found the keys to the house and we're moving in." The broadcast hit New Terra like a physical shock. In the command center, Harkon and Varric watched as the shimmering, unrecognizable silhouette of the Vanguard drifted into the orbital plane. It didn't look like a ship anymore. It looked like a shard of the heavens, a piece of the Dyson swarm brought to life. Behind it, the warp wake was still glowing, a bridge of blue fire that stretched back into the deep dark. They knew that everything had changed. The small squabbles over scrap and territory were over. A new era had begun, one defined by the friction between what humanity was and what they were becoming. Theron sat in his chair, watching the sunrise over the curve of New Terra. He missed Vaxon's swearing. He missed the smell of recycled oil. But as he looked at Kale, whose eyes were now clear and filled with the light of 1,000 suns, he knew that the sacrifice had been the price of admission. They were the architects of a new necessity, and the universe was finally starting to pay attention. The return of the Vanguard of Indifference was not the arrival of a vessel, but the manifestation of an omen. It hung above New Terra, a jagged, iridescent splinter that seemed to pull at the very fabric of the local gravitational field. The colony's orbital defense platforms, usually quick to challenge any unidentified silhouette, remained paralyzed, their targeting sensors unable to lock onto a hull that fluctuated between solid matter and coherent light. Inside the forward cabin, Theron felt the silence of the ship as a physical pressure. The air no longer tasted of oil and copper, it tasted of nothing, a sterile, absolute purity that felt alien in his lungs. He looked at his hands, where the faint blue luminescence had settled into his skin, tracing the lines of his veins like a glowing map. Kale was motionless, her neural interface no longer clicking or whirring. She had become a living conduit. Her consciousness expanded across the Xylo archives that were now physically integrated into the ship's reorganized structure. She informed Theron, without opening her mouth, that the Ravagers were no longer their primary concern. The entropy pulse had been a dinner bell, and the predators of the deep void were beginning to converge on the scent of a dying god's technology. On the surface of the station, Varric stood at the observation port, his face illuminated by the flickering blue ghost of the ship. He didn't need a sensor report to know that the crew who had left were not the ones who had returned. He felt a primal, bone-deep instinct to open fire, to protect the fragile normalcy of the human colonies from the transformation drifting above them. But Harkon, standing beside him, held a hand up. Harkon saw the tactical reality that Varric's instinct ignored. The Vanguard was the only thing standing between New Terra and the tidal wave of Ravagers currently folding through the outer sectors. The data being broadcast from the ship was a flood of architectural miracles, blueprints for shields that could withstand a star's collapse and engines that didn't just move through space, but rearranged it. It was a gift of fire, and like the first fire, it promised both warmth and total incineration. Harkon gave the order to open the primary docking umbilical, not for the ship to land, but for the information to be siphoned into the colony's hungry mainframes. The transition of data was a violent process. New Terra's systems, built on the jagged edge of necessity, buckled under the complexity of the Xylo logic. Screens across the colony flickered with impossible geometries, and the power grid surged, causing the vertical city's lights to flare with a brilliant, terrifying violet. Theron watched the progress from the cabin, feeling the weight of the archives leaving the ship and rooting themselves into the human foundation. He knew that once this knowledge was out, there was no going back. Humanity would no longer be the scavengers in the cracks. They would be the masters of a technology they didn't fully understand, a species catapulted into a higher tier of existence before they had even finished their own adolescence. He thought of Vaxon, who would have hated every second of this. Vaxon liked things he could hit with a wrench. You couldn't hit a multi-dimensional lattice with a wrench. As the download reached its zenith, a new signal cut through the noise, a jagged, dissonant transmission from the edge of the system. The Ravager flagship had arrived, having tracked the Vanguard's warp wake through the sublayers of reality, it wasn't alone. A dozen hive ships accompanied it, their hulls glowing with a sickly, parasitic hunger. They didn't offer a parley. They began to deploy boarding pods, thousands of them, aimed not just at the Vanguard, but at the new Terra station itself. The Ravagers had realized that the human variable was no longer just a nuisance. It was a competitor for the legacy of the Xylo. Theron felt the ship beneath him respond to his anger. The Vanguard didn't need engines to move anymore. It responded to intent. He felt the ship's hull ripple, the jagged edges smoothing into a lethal, predatory curve. He wasn't a pilot anymore. He was the brain of a celestial organism. Soren, who had been quietly arming the remaining manual charges in the forward hold, looked up at Theron. He saw the blue light in Theron's eyes and knew that the man he had served with was fading, replaced by something built for the coming conflict. Soren didn't ask for instructions. He simply asked if they were going to die here or in the middle of the enemy fleet. Theron's voice, echoing with the resonance of the Xylo spire, told him that death was an outdated concept. They were going to become a lesson. The Vanguard accelerated, not with a roar of thrusters, but with a silent, terrifying shift in position. One moment they were at the docking ring, the next, they were in the heart of the Ravager swarm. The ship didn't fire cannons. It emitted a localized entropy field, a bubble of reality where the laws of physics were whatever Theron willed them to be. Ravager ships that entered the field didn't explode. They simply ceased to be coherent, their matter unraveling into a fine mist of subatomic particles. The Ravager flagship, a mountain of organic metal, attempted to phase shift away from the Vanguard's approach. But Kale, her mind woven into the ship's tactical grid, anticipated the move. She reached out through the sensors and locked the flagship in place, anchoring its physical form to the local coordinates. The Vanguard slammed into the flagship, not as a kinetic impact, but as a conceptual one. The two vessels became entangled, their hulls merging in a horrific display of biological and crystalline fusion. Theron could feel the Ravager hive mind screaming in his head, a billion voices crying out in a language of pure consumption. He didn't recoil. He pushed back, flooding their collective consciousness with the variable of spite, the human refusal to accept the end. He showed them the heat of new Terra's forges, the grit of the Jovian mines, and the cold, hard determination of a species that had survived on the scraps of giants. The feedback was catastrophic for the Ravagers. Their hive mind, built on the principle of assimilation, couldn't process the sheer irrationality of the human spirit. The flagship began to tear itself apart from the inside, its internal organs rupturing as its cells tried to replicate the human drive for independence. On the New Terra monitors, the colony watched as the massive Ravager fleet began to flicker and dim, the ships falling out of formation like dead leaves. It was a victory, but it was a hollow one. Theron could feel the Vanguard's structural integrity failing. The merger with the flagship was permanent, and the energy required to maintain the entropy field was draining the ships and his own remaining life force. He looked at Kale, whose form was now almost entirely composed of light. She smiled, a small human gesture that looked out of place on her radiant face. She told him it was time to finish the calculation. Theron triggered the final sequence, a total release of the Xylo archives into the Ravager network. It wasn't just data, it was a virus of complexity. Every Ravager ship in the system was suddenly flooded with the history of the Xylo's failure, the weight of 1 billion years of stagnation. The swarm didn't just stop, it despaired. The translucent hulls of the alien ships turned to ash as their occupants simply gave up on the act of living. The Vanguard and the flagship, locked together in a terminal embrace, began to drift toward the New Terra atmosphere. Theron felt the heat of the entry, the flames licking at the viewport. He wasn't afraid. He had given his people the fire. He had given them the means to fight the dark. As the ship began to break apart, he sent one last message to Harkin and Varric, a simple, clear directive that bypassed their consoles and spoke directly to their hearts. Don't waste it. The Vanguard of Indifference streaked across the sky of New Terra like a falling star, a brilliant blue line that cut through the clouds and vanished into the dark ocean of the planet's southern hemisphere. The impact was silent, a ripple in the water that settled as quickly as it had appeared. In the command center, the silence was absolute. The Ravager threat was gone, the sky was clear, and the colony's mainframes were humming with the secrets of the universe. Varric looked at the empty space on the monitors where the ship had been. He didn't feel like a victor. He felt like a survivor who had just been handed the keys to a kingdom he wasn't sure he wanted. Harkon began to give orders, his voice steady but lacking its former clinical detachment. They had work to do. They had a legacy to build. And somewhere deep in the archives, the variable of spite remained, a small, flickering spark that would ensure humanity never truly found peace, only the next horizon. The aftermath of the battle was a period of frantic, fearful growth. The humans of New Terra used the Xylo data to transform their colony into a fortress, a hub of technological advancement that rivaled the myths of the old empires. They built ships that didn't leak, engines that didn't scream, and shields that couldn't be broken. But they never forgot the Vanguard. They built a monument in the central hub, not of stone or metal, but of light, a flickering blue flame that stood as a reminder of the price of sovereignty. They called it the calibration, the moment when humanity stopped being a rounding error and became the denominator of the galaxy. And though Theron and Kale were gone, their presence was felt in every weld, every line of code, and every defiant breath the colony took. The universe was still cold, and it was still dark, but New Terra was now a sun in its own right, a beacon of spite that would burn until the very end of time. The recovery of the New Terra colonies did not happen with the graceful unfolding of a programmed evolution, but with the violent, grinding momentum of a machine being rebuilt while its gears were still in motion. In the years following the descent of the Vanguard, the human frontier had ceased to be a collection of desperate outposts and had hardened into a singular, focused entity. The Xylo data had been a catalyst, but the true transformation was internal. The survivors had looked into the abyss of the Dyson swarm and realized that the universe did not offer a seat at the table. It offered only a grave. To avoid it, they had to become the table, the chair, and the knife. Harkon sat in the high tower of the New Terra Command spire, his eyes no longer scanning for simple mechanical failures, but monitoring the atmospheric stabilization of 3 neighboring moons. The humans were no longer just inhabiting the rock, they were sculpting it. The blue light of the Xylo-integrated power grid pulsed through the walls of the city like a heartbeat, a constant reminder of the variable of spite that had saved them. Varric, now gray-haired and moving with the stiff gait of a man who had outlived his era, stood by the viewport, watching the new fleet take shape in the orbital drydocks. These were not the scavenged hulls of the past. They were sleek, predatory shapes of shimmering alloy and integrated crystalline logic, ships that moved with the silent, terrifying grace of the Vanguard. The Ravagers were gone, or at least they had learned to avoid the sector with a fervor that bordered on religious dread. The few that remained in the fringes were mindless things, their hive link shattered by the conceptual virus Theron had unleashed. They were no longer predators, they were pests, easily cleared by the automated sentinel drones that now patrolled the human borders. But the galaxy was vast, and the Xylo were not the only ghosts haunting the dark. Deep space arrays were picking up signals from the core, ancient, massive entities that had watched the Xylo ascend and had waited for the dust to settle. These were the true inheritors, races that viewed the sudden rise of humanity not with curiosity, but with the cold irritation of a gardener finding a weed in a manicured bed. Harkon knew the peace was a temporary fluctuation, a brief lull before the next storm. He didn't fear it. He prepared for it with a meticulous, cold-blooded efficiency that would have terrified the humans of a century prior. They were no longer the prey. They were the anomaly that the universe couldn't solve, and they were preparing to make that the universe's problem. The monument in the central hub had grown. It was no longer just a flame of light. It was a repository of the names of every person lost since the first jump from the Sol system. Vaxon's name was there, etched in a font that shimmered with the same blue hue as the ship he had died to save. Theron and Kale were not listed as dead. They were listed as integrated, a term that had become a cornerstone of the new human philosophy. The line between biology and technology had blurred to the point of irrelevance. Every citizen of New Terra carried a fragment of the Xylo code, a neural dampener that allowed them to process the vast amounts of information required to run a star-spanning civilization. They were more than human, yet they clung to their human flaws, their anger, their humor, and their irrational stubbornness, as if those were the most precious resources they possessed. It was this friction, the union of alien perfection and human chaos, that made them a force that could not be predicted by the logic engines of the older races. In the deep research labs of the Southern Hemisphere, Soren worked in a silence that was frequently broken by the hum of localized gravity experiments. He had become the lead architect of the New Terra defense grid, a man obsessed with the idea of turning the entire system into a trap. He didn't want shields. He wanted a reality that refused to cooperate with an invader. He had spent years studying the wreckage of the Vanguard, which had been raised from the ocean floor and placed in a vacuum-sealed vault. The ship was no longer a vessel. It was a relic of the transition. Its hull was a mosaic of human steel and Xylo crystal, a physical manifestation of the compromise that had birthed their new world. Soren often touched the cold, iridescent surface, wondering if any fragment of Theron's consciousness remained within the lattice. He didn't believe in ghosts, but he believed in echoes. He believed that the defiance of that final moment had been so powerful that it had left a permanent scar on the local fabric of space-time. The first contact with the true inheritors came not with a ship, but with a silencing. A neighboring system, one the humans had been preparing for terraforming, simply vanished from the sensors. No explosion, no warp signature, just a sudden, absolute absence. Harkon didn't panic. He didn't call for a diplomatic envoy. He signaled the fleet to engage the calamity protocols. The new ships, led by the flagship Persistence of Memory, moved into the void with a synchronization that was terrifying to behold. They didn't go to investigate, they went to reclaim. When they arrived at the coordinates of the missing system, they found a massive, geometric structure, a world-eater of the inheritors, slowly folding the local space into a pocket dimension. The inheritors were not used to resistance. They expected the lesser races to flee or to worship. They did not expect a fleet of shimmering shards to open fire with kinetic entropy rounds that tore through their multi-dimensional shields like paper. The battle was not a skirmish. It was a statement. The humans didn't fight for territory. They fought for the right to exist without permission. The World Eater, a machine the size of a planetoid, was hit by a coordinated strike that utilized the very entropy pulse technology that had broken the Ravagers. The Inheritor consciousness, vast and ancient, felt a sudden, sharp pain as the human variable of spite flooded its systems. It encountered a species that didn't follow the laws of cosmic progression, a species that had skipped 1,000,000 years of evolution through sheer, unadulterated theft and tenacity. The World Eater shuddered, its gravitational anchors failing as the human fleet swarmed over it like white blood cells attacking a virus. Within hours, the geometric nightmare was a cloud of cooling debris, and the missing system was restored to reality, albeit scarred and broken. The universe was quiet again, but it was the silence of a predator that had just realized it was in a cage with something much smaller and much meaner. Harkon watched the feed from the Persistence of Memory as the fleet returned to New Terra. He saw the blue glow of the engines, the sharp lines of the hulls, and the faces of the crew, men and women who were no longer afraid of the dark. He knew that this was just the beginning. The inheritors would return with more force, and other, older things would wake up to challenge the upstarts. But as he looked at the flickering blue flame in the hub below, he felt a sense of profound, icy clarity. Humanity had never been invited to the stars. They had never been given a destiny. They had carved one out of the ruins of a dead empire and the bodies of their own martyrs. They were the architects of their own necessity, and they were perfectly comfortable with the friction of their existence. The universe would try to erase them, as it had erased the Xylo and 1,000 others before them, but humanity had a secret weapon that the gods had never accounted for. They didn't know how to give up. As the sun set over New Terra, the light caught the crystalline spires of the city, turning them into a forest of amber and violet. The people below went about their lives, building, learning, and laughing in the face of an indifferent cosmos. They were the calibration of the universe, the point at which logic failed and spirit took over. Theron and Kale were gone, but their legacy was written in the atmosphere of 12 worlds and the cold, hard steel of 1,000 ships. The story of humanity was no longer a tragedy of survival, it was a manual of defiance. And as the stars began to twinkle in the darkening sky, each one a potential battlefield or a potential home, the people of New Terra looked up and didn't see a threat. They saw a challenge. They saw a vast, empty house that was waiting for a new master, one who wasn't afraid to get their hands dirty or to burn the whole thing down if it meant staying warm for one more night. The Vanguard of Indifference was a name from a forgotten age. The new age didn't have a name yet, but it had a sound, the rhythmic, steady pulse of 1 billion hearts beating in sync with a technology that had been mastered through spite. The galaxy was no longer a graveyard of failed ambitions, it was a workshop, and the humans were just getting started. Harkon turned away from the viewport, his mind already calculating the logistics of the next expansion. He didn't need to look back to know that the blue flame was still burning. It would always be burning, as long as there was one human left to strike a match against the dark. The universe had tried to calibrate humanity out of existence, but in doing so, it had only succeeded in proving that some variables are meant to be infinite.